How's the audio?
Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening to some. Good afternoon to others. Thanks ever so much for joining us here at Warp and Woof Radio. Over 220 episodes now since February of 2016. Grateful for you to join us, whether you're joining us here live or later on the archived edition. We'll also have MP3, MP4 available. Grateful, of course, to do these kinds of have these kinds of opportunities to talk with Christians around the nation as well as around the world, quite frankly, about the things that they're invested in. And today we have a great opportunity to invest some time with Justin Forman, who's the executive director of Faith Driven Entrepreneur. And we're grateful, Justin, for your time today. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Hey, Mark, it's great to be with you.
So this afternoon, why don't you just kind of start us off here with a little bit of a bio and tell us about yourself, your family, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick flyover. Like several of the other guests that you've had on the show, was privileged and had the opportunity to grow up in Adrian, Michigan, be a part of LCS there and just benefit from the teaching and the structure that you invested in so many of us at a young age. Like every kid dreams of growing up in Michigan, I got to move to Little Rock, Arkansas. So I quickly learned on the first day about duck hunting and what it means to go mudding and why you should put a bunch of mud on your truck and not wash it off for a few days. So boots, I have my cowboy boots, my CHL, a shotgun and everything to go with it. And somewhere along the way, I ended up at a place called Baylor. And so I met my wife there. She's from West Texas, and I missed the fine print on a marriage certificate that said Texas residency is required. When you marry a girl from West Texas. And so here we find ourselves. We're outside of Dallas. We've been here for ever since school. So about to turn that big 4-0 this year. And we've got 3 kids, 11, 8, and 6. And so on the weekends, you can find me as the girls' Pixie Chicks girls soccer coach or kindergarten basketball coach. So those are the important details.
There you go. That's great. West Texas, man. There's nothing like stories out of West Texas. That's I suppose right. We need to have a whole other episode on something like that.
Yeah, there's a culture episode just to have on that alone.
Well, thanks again for joining us and for giving us a little bit of background. But really what we're interested in talking about here today is the concepts that you're developing and have given your life to really over the last 20 years or so, which is the focus on vocation and specifically for Christians in vocation. Tell us just to begin here today, why is it so important for Christians to consider vocation as imperative in their lives?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, it just kind of comes back to a little bit of my journey. I mean, I went to school at a place like Baylor that, great faith roots and Baptist traditions and history there. And, I was privileged to work in the dean's office there at the business school. And, growing up in the church, I always thought, man, I want to do something that has some of this lasting impact, but I just never felt called to be that singer, preacher, or teacher. Just thought, man, what does it look like to do something different? And, I remember distinctively going into the dean's office there. I was working there, just talking one day and said, hey, what does it look like to really put these two together? And at the time, it was kind of short on answers. He just said, hey, you should go to the seminary. I think they've got an executive pastor role. Maybe you should pursue that. And that's great. And it was awesome to see that the opportunities and roles that have been created in that over the years. But I just felt that entrepreneurial itch. And, I distinctively remember somewhere in that college journey, walking across campus and having one of those moments where I was just like, all right, God, enough of trying to do this on my own. What does this look like? If I just say, say what you already know, God, this is yours. What does it look like to give that back to you? And I remember walking into the student union building like 5 seconds later. And sure enough, it happened to be missions emphasis week. And I ended up on one of these trips and I thought it was going to be this traditional mission trip and a kind of an experience, but God had other plans. He kind of rerouted it. And before you know it, that trip got canceled. I ended up on this other adventure is probably the best way to describe it. It was this summer of reality TV craze that was starting and Road Rules and Survivor was starting. And they took 12 of us, 20 and 30 somethings around the world in about 40 days. And we got to see just God at work at so many different places. And I like to say I kind of came back from that ruined in a good way. They had taken a video camera with us, asked us all those questions like, what do you want to do with your life? And all those things that you're supposed to have an answer to when you're 19 or 20. And, I just walked away from that thinking, okay, I've seen God using business people, whether it was in the outback of Australia or a business person in a place like Indonesia or India or different things. I just came back thinking God can use business people. He can use me as an entrepreneur. And so I came back just with that passion of just saying, what does it look like to fuse those two together? That video company and ministry that had put together that trip was a small publisher here in Dallas producing a resource or two a year. And I came on board just thinking, man, God just used me here. And it was just a fun journey. It was a third generation kind of family stewarded ministry that just looks to really create content and tell stories. And so for about 12, 15 years or 12, a little bit more than a dozen years, I was a part of just building this thing called Right Now Media, which today is kind of the Netflix of video studies for churches, serves about 3 million people around the world in doing that. And so that was a little bit of the journey. That was kind of the first taste for me of really what does it look like to fuse your faith and your work together. I think along that way, you just start talking to more people and recognizing this is a much bigger conversation, and that God was at work and he's afoot doing something in churches, and everybody saying, how do you fuse these things together? I think some of the statistics, when you really look at it, you and I have talked about this before, is we spend most of our waking hours thinking about some sort of vocational crossing. As a dad of 3, husband, working, there's not a lot of leftover time. And oftentimes I think we've always had this culture that thinks you can keep adding, but really it's got to be about what does it look like to repurpose, and how do we take those waking hours? And when you add it up, I think some surveys say you spend 52% or so of your waking hours at work. So what does it look like to really kind of shift that? And so, I'd like to say that as a life calling, it's been, to be a follower of Jesus, to be a husband, to be a dad, but also then to really say, what does it look like to help the church, the Big C Church as a whole, just recognize the power and opportunity there is in really unleashing that business community. So long answer, but no,
that's great. Great answer. Something that stood out to me, and as you were talking, was the concept of story and content. Tell us a little bit about why story is so important and how that communicates with people.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think that story just has the power to inspire and to validate in a way that few other things can. I think that even especially in today's culture, story is what connects. You hear the story of a person, you see the story of something on social media. And I think that that's the one thing that sometimes still has the power to influence. I think when people talk positions or mention positions, pretty much it's kind of hardwired. People know what they stand for, against, but oftentimes it's stories. It's the stories of people that can catalyze a movement, that can catalyze a conversation, that can change the narrative. I just think they have a way to inspire and validate things in a way that, like, if you say something, I could maybe look at that and theologically I could pick at it and say, hey, let me push back on that. But if you tell me your story, you're telling me your story. I don't have the right to rewrite your story. It's yours. And it's yours that you have to steward. And so I think that there's something powerful about that. We learned that a lot with Right Now Media, and that was people long before even my time there that had recognized there's just something about that story that can really connect with people. I think we see that in the business community as well, and we're trying to do that with Faith-Driven Entrepreneur and Faith-Driven Investors. Is that growing up, trying to be that, chasing those athletic dreams. You saw the people on the big screen of who you wanted to be, but in the area of fusing faith and work, nobody really knew what that looked like. And so we're trying to capture the stories of kind of these humble heroes that are out there behind the scenes and and let another generation know what does it look like to really love Jesus and to do that in a vocational sense.
It fascinates me because teaching in a public setting as well as Christian settings, I try to encourage people all the time to talk about story and tell story. How do you think story then kind of wedges in or creates a space or an opening for conversations about the faith with those who maybe are in that particular business or vocation but aren't Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that I come back a little bit to some of what I've alluded to there earlier is just the idea of it's still the place where things are pliable. It's still the place where people will listen. I think that there's so much in the cancel culture that a lot of times that they're canceling the viewpoint, but I don't know that they're canceling the person. I think that we're quick to cancel a viewpoint more than we are to cancel that person. In fact, the culture is actually pushing back the opposite and saying, kind of almost like it's your story, it's your truth, it's your that, whatever. And we can disagree with some of that, but there's like an obligation that we have to listen, an obligation that we have to hear it. And I think as long as that obligation to listen to somebody's story is there, to hear what they're empathizing, what they're going through, that's an open door. And in a place when all those other doors are closing, this is one that seemed one of the very few that's opening wider. And so I think that's just an opportunity. When I think of the part of the church that we attend here in Dallas, really talks about this idea of leading with a limp and leading this idea of in our brokenness. And I think that is really more inspiring. I think we're so frankly burnt out of the stories of the fame and the success and all of that. But I think that when you break the narrative and you really lead with that brokenness, let's face it, we talk about this with entrepreneurs, investors, or athletes. There is this pressure, there's this perception that we should have it all together. I think we see that even in the conversations, maybe with entrepreneurs and investors, whether you're the CEO, the leader, or you're the quarterback on the football team, everybody wants to feel like they have it all together. We're kind of told you're supposed to. But when people lead out in their brokenness and they lead out with a limp and they really kind of reverse engineer the thing, that's what shoots to the top of the social media charts. That's what shoots to the top of conversations. And I'm struck by that. Some of the men and women that we've been able to interview, you interview a guy that's taking a big company public, or you do a podcast with somebody that's the MVP of a Super Bowl winning team. We've heard that. You can do a Google search and find 30,000 results of that person talking about that. But when that person says, here's my struggle with anxiety, here's my struggle with identity, here's my struggle with sexual brokenness, here's my struggle with all these other things, then all of a sudden it gets real. Then all of a sudden that we all have cracks, and those cracks need to be filled, and we know what can fill them. But I just think that the story has always been there, but I think it's coming even more alive to being the language and the one door that's opening. And I think when that does happen, I know that in my own life I've learned that put the polish away, lead in your brokenness, and if you do that, I think it penetrates all the more deep.
It sounds vaguely like Jesus.
It's strange how that works, isn't it?
How about that?
Yeah.
That's an important ideal there. Let's talk a little bit about the specifics of, you're talking about entrepreneurs and investors in particular. You mentioned a dollar amount a few moments ago before we went on air about how much money there is either being transferred or available now via Christian entrepreneurs and investors. Talk to people about that a little bit and give them a sense of what that even looks like.
Yeah, great question. it's been super encouraging to see churches as a whole. I think that if I walked into the dean's office at Baylor again today, 20 years later, that the conversation would be different. And that's tremendously encouraging because of the faithful work of so many ministries and churches and businesses that have said that your work matters, and that there is an intentionality of saying, like, how does that matter and how do we help that? I think that where I feel called, and a group of us feel called, is to saying that the businessmen and women that are the entrepreneurs and the investors have tremendous opportunities to create culture. I mean, you look at entrepreneurs and they get as much time with 10, 20, 50, 100 people in their office than their families. And so they have a tremendous opportunity to love, to shape, to care for those people in some unique ways. I think when you talk about investors, we don't have to look very far into our economy right now to say that the growth of our economy, the jobs, the flourishing, human flourishing, can sometimes be rapidly accelerated by the intentionality of investors. And so this phase of life for me is to say, and really I think that next step of personal calling is to say, what does it look like to help those entrepreneurs and investors feel they're not alone, to feel that there's a movement afoot, that there's a community, to really encourage that movement, to build that out. I think if we're looking at the faith and work movement as kind of this house, they're the load-bearing walls of it. And if we're going to grow the house, if we're going to build it stronger, we've got to build those stronger. Otherwise, it can get out of proportion and out of weight. And so that's what we're doing. I think when you talk about some of the statistics of what we're talking about, I think you can look at it like 70%. And the other thing I clarify is entrepreneurship doesn't necessarily mean Bay Area tech sector type of stuff. I mean, 70% of the U.S. economy is family-owned businesses. We're talking about what does it look like to be the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker in a way that loves Jesus. And so there's that element from the entrepreneur side. On the investor side of things, this is kind of like the new conversation, the newer conversation. It's not new in the sense of that it hasn't been around, but I think that there's a new intentionality and new focus that's been really encouraging to see, is that you've got this community of men and women that are saying that things don't have to be mutually exclusive, that you can pursue something that has spiritual impact and financial return. And what does it look like to pursue those two things? And the amount, as like you're alluding to, it's staggering. When you look at it, that they estimate, and some recent estimates, when you extrapolate and look at some research and studies, about 50%, maybe 52, 55% of global wealth, they believe, is stewarded by somebody that professes to be Christian. When you put that to a number, probably pre-COVID, you're talking about $150 trillion. Okay? That amount of capital, when you look at that, that's about 200 to 300 times what is given philanthropically each year. So we put so much emphasis on a church, and rightly so, about being generous, because I think generosity is kind of the gateway. It's got to be foundational to thinking about how then you steward your assets. But I think that when we look at that's only the beginning. What does it look like to even take it further? And what does it look like to sit there and say, my money is going to go to work, not necessarily just in funds that screen out, the traditional sin stocks or whatever it might be, but could it go for something that could promote, human flourishing? Could it, if I invest in a multifamily housing complex, could it be something that, is trying to pursue financial return, but maybe has an intentionality of saying that, we should care for those people in our community and recognize the opportunity that we have to be the hands and feet of Jesus to them. 37% of our country lives in multifamily units. 96% of them nationwide are occupied. What used to be a transitional form of housing is now the place where kids are growing up, going to high school, spending much of their life. So what does it look like to do that? Well, there's ministries that we're big fans of, like Apartment Life, that come in there and they lease they give basically a unit there for somebody to come in and serve as a part-time chaplain and care. And they're a social chair for the apartment complex. My sister was able to do that when she was getting her feet here in Dallas, and she had a chance to throw events and host things and minister to the people that were there. But the apartment complex also benefits. They find that community that's built there that you're developing, typically the data is showing that it delivers like $180,000 bottom line return for the apartment complex. So it just, it turns out that being a good neighbor is not just, good ministry. It happens to be good business too, in that business sense. And so, that's one element. But this isn't like just one asset class or one vehicle. This is really, it's a mindset. It's a mindset of that you bring, that you recognize that God owns it all, that I'm stewarding his investments. And then once you've freed up that thought, it gives you that freedom to think, okay, how do I put this capital to work in a way that's not pursuing just a single bottom line, but something that's pursuing multiple bottom lines. And so that, that's a fun conversation that is happening, and it's happening amongst some of the most looked to foundations, family offices, investors across the country, from small town to Bay Area and in between. And it's really hopeful to think what that could look like and what that could mean, because capital has influence. I mean, we don't look far for it. I mean, we speak a language today because some of the early voyages were sponsored in venture capital of people coming over. Sure, there was the religious element to it, but there was a business side of that too as well. The devices in which we consume our media and then we consume our content and that we share our images, they are sponsored by people and ventures that have a certain viewpoint and values and systems there. So it has tremendous influence, and I think it has tremendous opportunity, and it's exciting to see the church starting to wake up to that.
One of the words that you've used regularly throughout these 20 minutes or so is the word intentionality. How do you get the church to be intentional about the very passion that you're suggesting here this afternoon?
That's great. I think that I'm not saying that at 39 I'm any younger, dumber than I was at 19, but maybe a little bit more aged. But I would say probably in your youth. In my youth, I'd say that I pointed to just that youthful ambition. You just want to go, and if you feel a dead end, you just go around it. Maybe that was the entrepreneurial sense in me. There's a guy that poured a lot into me and has poured a lot into my life. Guy Marty that really taught me this idea that the church really is God's plan A, and that there is that element also that we can't overlook. Even if you just see that, one, two, you have to recognize it's probably the greatest marketing channel that you find in the church today. I mean, for better or worse, for as fragmented as it is, as niche as it might be, sometimes it is one of the greatest channels to get a message out. And I think a lot of times the faith and work conversation, it's an entrepreneurial community. And when they face roadblocks and they face dead ends, we're not a patient people group as entrepreneurs. And so we tend to go out there and we just create. And so I think there's that, but I think the unintentional consequences is then all of a sudden kind of puts the pastor and the entrepreneur in different places and frankly, they're more alike than they ever would imagine. Mm-hmm. They're both entrepreneurial. They're both out there, building something, conversation, business, or whatever it is. And so I think it has to start with this idea of the pastor and business leader, meaning that we're building the same empire, and that empire that we're building is neither of ours. It's the kingdom. But there's that quick temptation that we have to really just focus on what is ours and what we think is ours. And so, there's this idea of just what does it look like for the fruit to grow on other people's trees? And what does that look like? I hear the stories of pastors that have been tremendously just impactful to people. And I think oftentimes, sometimes it is the story of somebody whose life was impacted. They came on staff and they were part of that church for the next 20, 30 years or whatever it is. But so many times it's the person that they just affirmed, they encouraged, they unleashed, and that person just went. And so I think that the first part is you have to really make sure that the church owns it. The church is a part of it. That doesn't mean that, the pastor is going to teach you about economics and, your balance sheet. But I think it means is that we recognize that we put the gloves down, we put the boxing gloves down and we recognize we're on the same team here. And I think that what you find, there's Made to Flourish is a great group led by a guy named Tom Nelson, a good friend, a pastor, that really is just this idea of recognizing that as a pastor, he missed it for a while, but there are people that were patient, that got it, and they recognize the more that they encourage people in their vocation, the more that those people even came back to want to give, to invest more in the other areas of the ministry. And there's that reciprocal thing. But I think that we're on the crazy cycle. And if we don't break that crazy cycle and recognize that we're on the same team, that we'll miss it. And oftentimes we can just miss what's right there in front of us.
So. One of the things that strikes me as I hear you talking about those things is, wouldn't it be cool if every month, let's say 1 month, builders were brought up and prayed for as missionaries to the community, and the next month the bankers, and the next month the homemakers, next month the plumbers and the carpenters, instead of just focusing or thinking that missions is going to the campus or going across to a different continent or whatever.
Yeah, no, I think you're right on to something there. I think that, a pastor that I heard Justin Buzzard was starting a church out in the Bay Area, and he just talked about the community and the people group that he was ministering to. And he recognized there's so much of this, like asking people to come to me, when it was really like, I need to go to them. And he just started this idea of, hey, once a week, he was going to try and grab lunch with somebody from his church in their place of work. And so, a business owner invites him in, comes in and does that. And just the appreciation it gave him, and just the learning opportunity it gave him to contextualize just who is it that he's ministering to and what that audience is like. And I think you're right, whether it's visiting the person there in person, or whether that's making sure that up from the stage, it's not just a short-term mission trip group that we're praying for, but here in 6 weeks, I'm saying this as the spouse of a teacher, man, talk about opportunities, talk about needs, praying for those teachers as they go back into this crazy environment. They are not just going to be educators, they are going to be life counselors and coaches dealing with tremendously anxious parents, kids, and so much in between. And if we miss that as a church, I think we're missing the lion's share, and we're focused in on kind of the leftovers of it sometimes.
This has been fantastic. Justin, thanks so much for your time today. Knowing that you're a busy guy, not only with what you do in your vocation, but being a husband and a dad, and now knowing that your wife is an educator. Robin and I are educators and love other educators. So greetings to your wife as well in this regard.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And, I would be remiss to not say that it's the humble heroes of yourself that have faithfully invested in so many of us at the school that I was a part of, and the schools that you've been a part of since, that hopefully it's some sort of encouragement just to see the fruit of that labor growing on other people's trees, and such a wide and diverse community that we are. So grateful for what you've done, and thanks for letting me be a part of this.
I appreciate that, Justin. Thanks so much. And everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. If you catch us on the archived edition of this, look forward to a great opportunity to think differently about how we approach work and vocation. This has been Warp and Woof Radio. We'll come to you again next week as we introduce another student from years past. Thankful for the opportunities to do this. For Justin, again today, thanks. And thanks everybody for joining us. Until next time, we'll see you then.